Welcome. Don't adjust your dial. Welcome everyone to the Lofi Poli Sci podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pickering. That's right. Lo-Fi's and low fidelity, low quality, in your face, messy as can be global news show. And today, Gregory Day, a writer, director, bookseller, and the voice behind Hipsville AD, the blog that is the one-man fanatical sect of God of subculture with fervent ramblings of all breeds of cinematic pleasures. Gregory Day, my friend, how are you doing?
Man, I'm doing fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing excellent myself, my friend. And let's go ahead and jump right into it because we have lots to talk about. What top 10 film list have you created for us today?
Oh, hell yeah. We have a lot to talk about today. Today, I wanted to bring a list to kind of contextualize some stuff I had talked about in previous lists. So I'm coming here to talk about top 10 film movements or new waves in cinema.
All right, this is like super interesting. It's like, I love it because you're talking about 10 films, but you're also talking meta about the actual movements in these different places. So I can't wait for it. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Coming in at number 10.
Yeah. So the way this is going to work, I'm going to run down the movement, and then I'm going to talk about a few films here and there. And I'm going to talk about one movie that you should watch that sort of represents that movement. So kicking things off, we're going to talk about parallel Indian cinema, specifically in the 1950s and 1960s. So if anyone knows anything about Indian cinema, I think internationally it's identified by Bollywood, which is from Mumbai, and it's sort of described as like epics and musicals and lavish studio productions. But parallel cinema is from West Bengal, and it's kind of as old as Bollywood, but it really kicks off here in the 50s and 60s. And this is something that's more similar to or similar to like Japanese and European art house films. So films like Mother India or The Cloud Capped Star. But what I really want to talk about is Satyajit Ray's Pather Panchali, which is about a poor family just living through the hardships of life, but finding the small pleasures in life. So it's told through the eyes of these children who are watching like terrible things happen to their family, like disease and illness and just horrific weather, but they're also experiencing these beautiful things in nature and the love they experience in their life. So it's it has a lot of focus on realism as far as like what the average Indian person would go through, as opposed to these sort of epic fantasies that Bollywood would produce.
Yeah, let me ask you. So it looked like this movie followed the life of one individual and everything that happened around them. Is that right?
Yeah. So Pather Panchali is actually the first in a trilogy of this character named Apu, and he's a child in this film. And there's the second film where he's an adolescent, and then there's a third film where he's an adult and he's getting married, and you see how his life and his travels affect him and how it shapes him as a person.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting to me, and the concept about just life in India and the hardships through time, because this movie came out in 1955. The idea with the parallel Indian cinema to me, thinking 1955, this is just about 7 years after Indian independence. Like
Mm.
they are a brand new country at this point, just got rid of the UK as their government, and now they're finally able to do their own thing. So being able to watch that story unfold on film, super, super interesting to me.
Yeah, I didn't know that that was so close to their independence. I mean, they have a long history of cinema, but dating back to the silent era. So I would definitely be interested in learning more about how their cinema reflects how the changeover in government.
Right. I'd imagine that since they're looking at it through the perspective of one person over three films in their life, like it really is a backdrop of the story of how India as a country and the people in it in particular, like the personal story takes place over that time period. So yeah, I
Mhm.
definitely like this choice for sure. All right, coming in at number 9, what do we have?
Oh yeah, number nine. I had to throw in one genre movement just because genre is my thing. So this one isn't necessarily one that you need to know to get into the history of cinema or anything, but I wanted to spotlight it. It's called the New French Extremity. It's from the early 2000s. This is sort of a post 9/11, post war in the Middle East movement that is sort of a stand up to the rising conservatism in French politics and the urban isolationism happening in the cities. And this is sort of told through horror films about breaking taboos about sexuality and violence on screen. French films are not typically notable for their violence, but these films are incredibly violent. We're talking about films like Inside and Irreversible and In My Skin and Martyrs. Martyrs is such a brutal movie. Even the director apologized for even making it.
Wow.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. But the film I want to talk about today is from one of our greatest living filmmakers, Claire Denis. It's called Trouble Every Day from 2001. It's a film about urban isolationism and how lust is all consuming. And this lust pushes people to cannibalism. So it's sort of a subtextual vampire film that is, you see things like the coffin and sort of a Renfield character kind of built into this film, but it's not your typical vampire story, but it's a just a way that shows like how we're so, in the modern world, we're so apart from each other that these emotions become overwhelming to the point where we push them into acts of violence. So I mean, right now it seems like the same thing's sort of happening in the news every day, where people are having these outbreaks of violence and pent up frustration. So this film goes a long way to talking about how the state of the world is right now.
Yeah, and I really like, the fact that this is something fairly recent, from 2001, although some of our listeners may be like, hey, I was born that year. Still, 2001 is recent. Um, but to address some of the things that you said, this film deals with, sexual taboos and cinema and conservatism and the rise and the post 9/11 world. And very much in 1999, moving into 2000, a lot of us thought the world was changing. We thought that life and how we view things were evolving, and we as a species were becoming more connected. And yet, this film, even in the preview, you see things like interracial sex scene, where previously in film, to a large degree, you would see it here and there, but still, interracial relationships in film are not extremely common.
Mm-hmm.
And to the degree that you see this in 2001 as part of, yes, the world is in this new millennia, but is it really changing that much? And it makes you think, and new French extremity, it makes me wonder if this isn't really a movement that causes us to pause and think about, just because the date has changed, does that mean who we are has changed?
That's very true. And I think for listeners who are maybe not familiar with this, this is around the same time as like Saw and the torture porn movement. But these films are much more artsy as opposed to sort of a reaction to sort of the carnage and violence we saw on TV all the time when those films came out. But this is yeah, it's definitely a political movement through genre.
Excellent, excellent. You know how I feel normally about genre, but I like how this is topical for sure. All right, let's jump to number 8. What do you got?
Yeah, so this is one I've brought up before. This is the Taiwanese New Wave. This was predominantly in the mid to late 80s and the early 90s. I talked about when I did my East Asian cinema list, I talked about a film, Taipei Story. And so what this is, to kind of recover it, is a bunch of filmmakers in Taiwan just fed up with the fact that Chinese and Japanese and American films are kind of dominating their culture, and they wanted to go out and make films that reflected what it was like to be Taiwanese. And so films like Taipei Story, Rebels of the Neon God, A Time to Live and a Time to Die, Flowers of Shanghai, these sort of films that were predominantly made by two guys, Edward Yang and Ho Xiaoshen, really wanted to show people what it was like to live in this country that was tied to China culturally and through their heritage, but also looking towards a more liberal future and a more capitalistic future, and the struggles that those two things kind of create for them. But the film that I really wanted to discuss today that I think embodies this movie the best is called A Brighter Summer Day from 1991, directed by Edward Yang, which is set in the 50s during the military rule of Taiwan, and really shows the American influence coming in, where they're getting these Elvis records imported, and all these youth gangs are battling for territory in their area, and it's pretty vicious. They have samurai swords left over from the war, and they're fighting each other. But they're also in these rock and roll bands, where they're covering Elvis songs and they're covering doo-wop tracks, and there's this influence of America coming in, and you can really see the gap of the generations changing, or expanding, I should say, to where the youth are really into this freedom, this American culture, and this consumerism, whereas the older generation is not. This is like a 4-hour epic, but it goes
Oh,
by,
wow.
yes, it goes by incredibly quickly, or it goes by really quickly, and it's such a satisfying watch.
Yeah, right away, I was thinking when looking at this, I was like, is this set in the 1950s or 60s? Or, what's the deal here? Is it some kind of transition going on? But now, it makes sense. And I see a few things in it where, you mentioned doo-wop, and at one point towards the end of the trailer, there's this young band doing kind of like this bluesy doo-wop performance. And to me, it really called back to, Back to the Future when Marty McFly is about to get on stage and they have the
Uh-huh.
doo-wop band in the 50s and
Yeah.
60s, that same kind of musical movement.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
then you
Yeah.
talk about, the influence of capitalism and democracy basically about to come in because in the 1980s and 90s, that's where Taiwan really becomes the democracy we know it as today. Like you said
Hmm.
before, it was a military regime. So to see it, and I imagine to tell the whole story from then to now, 4 hours kind of makes sense to me. Um, but yeah,
Yeah,
this.
well,
Oh, I'm
sorry, I
sorry.
should say that it is the whole film is actually set like in one summer, so it doesn't really like expand beyond just that one time, that one little like snapshot in time. So it's just really focusing on that time during the military rule and this sort of like dissatisfaction with the youth living under it.
I still like that because, this is also coming off of, or at least in the film in the 1950s,
Hmm.
it's coming off the end of the Chinese Civil War after World War II. And so life in Taiwan is very different than what people espouse life to Taiwan in today. So the fact that it's a film in 1991 that's still calling back to that and showing us, I think it's completely fascinating. All right, let's go ahead and go to number 7. What do you have for us now?
Yeah, number 7 is one I'm very excited to talk about. It's the Hong Kong New Wave from the 80s and the 90s. This is truly one of the most impactful movements ever in cinema, especially if you are into genre cinema or if you're into action movies. This this movement is kind of twofold. One, there's this movement of filmmakers who are trying to explore what it means to be from Hong Kong. You're Chinese, but you're not really part of China. You have Western politics, but you're not really in the West. And there's this, it's at the peak of their economic boom. There's this capitalism going on, which doesn't really quite gel with the spirituality of their people. And so they have these romances and these dramas that are coming out from filmmakers like Wong Kar-wai and Anne Hui, and that are just excellent films. But you also have on the other side is this boom in action cinema. So you have your directors like John Woo and Jackie Chan and Sammo Hung, who had been previously, sort of stars in the 70s, but they really came to the forefront in the 80s, just making films that really innovated action cinema, and it changed that forever. Obviously, as a lot of those guys came to America and made notable films later on in their careers. But the movie I want to talk about today captures both of those things perfectly well is from 1987. It's called City on Fire. And it's directed by Ringo Lam, who's one of the best directors of this time period. This is a police story. It's an undercover cop who has infiltrated this bank robbing gang, and he begins to forget his role. He begins to have sympathy for this one particular guy in the gang, and his allegiances are torn. He doesn't know what to do. And if anyone has seen Reservoir Dogs, that movie is stolen from this film all over. Shot for shots, just the whole idea of like the two guys bonding. One's a cop and one is a thief. But really, it shows like the economic pressures on these people to do these desperate things, such as robbing banks, or this cop who has to, he has no other way to live except for doing this, and he's really tempted by this lifestyle that he's been introduced to. And yeah, if you're looking for like a great action film that's socially conscious, this is the one you need to check out.
Yeah, most certainly. I definitely got the vibe of, Jackie Chan and Chow Yun-fat movies in the 80s and before and moving into it, but also the parallel for US action cinema at the time, and definitely like borrowing from each other because, a lot of people may not realize it, but people like Jackie Chan, Chow Yun-fat, these individuals do their own stunts in their action movies. So their action cinema to me in those films, it looks a whole lot more real than a lot of the action you were seeing in US cinema. How would you make that comparison?
Oh yeah, I would say that the Hong Kong action community, from whenever it started in the silent era through now, has pushed the envelope more than any other place on the world has done. The innovations they've done to like putting powder on their stunt people, so when the hits happen, you could see those things coming off of them, or stunts with wires, even if they're not doing like exaggerated stunts, just to pull someone harder, just to sell the hit more on screen. They just do so much to innovate the action, where the rest of the world really took from that.
Definitely, and you most certainly see a lot of martial arts choreography and fight choreography individuals coming from Hong Kong and being hired by
Mm-hmm.
Hollywood, most certainly for all those reasons.
Oh yeah, yeah. And if I didn't mention before, but you brought Chow Yun Fat up, he is the star of City on Fire. For all those people who've seen him in Pirates of the Caribbean movies or other American action films or Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, he is one of the pivotal stars of the Hong Kong New Wave.
Yeah, and to me, especially the year this comes out, 1987, and like you said, this is Hong Kong is part of China, but it's not part of China, and it's part of the West, but not part of the West. And for people who aren't quite aware, 1987, Hong Kong was still a colony of the UK, of Great
Mm-hmm,
Britain.
mm-hmm.
It wasn't until 10 years later in 1997 and thereafter that the UK gave up Hong Kong back to China. So I'd be interested in like a little comparison, not today, but like at some point in the future, Hong Kong cinema under the UK, like in the 1980s and early 90s, compared to Hong Kong cinema today under Beijing controlled China, and to see, if there are any differences with cinematic freedoms that they could take. Like I said, not for today, though.
Yeah, perhaps another top 10 list.
Yeah, perhaps. All right, coming in at number 6, where are we going?
Yeah. So the next I want to talk about in relation to each other. So number 6, we're going all the way back to the beginning of cinema with German Expressionism in the 1920s and 1930s. If you're looking for a place to start with cinema history, this is really where you should begin. So much of cinematic language was created by the German studio system at this time, during the Weimar Republic. So we got films such as Metropolis and M and The Last Laugh and Nosferatu, Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans. Directors like Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau, they just wrote all the rules really during the silent era, and these films were categorized by exaggerated sets and just strange angles and dark shadows, and they just really they did everything. Like, you can go back and you can watch a film like The Last Laugh, and you can see stuff that's in Inception, whenever that movie came out.
Oh, wow.
So there's like things you see that have been going on forever. These people, these guys really innovated so much in cinema. Like Hitchcock was a assistant director to these guys. So they just really started the foundation of everything. But the film I want to talk about here that everyone should check out is called The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920. So it's a little over 100 years old, by Robert Veen, the director. And it's sort of a horror picture about a mad scientist who has this somnambulist, which is, I wasn't quite sure what that meant when I first saw it, but it's like sort of a sleepwalking zombie that he uses to kidnap women and sort of do his bidding. But it's the first film that has a twist ending, where
Really?
it pulls the rug out from beneath you at the end of the film. Won't give it away, but it's
100-year-old spoiler.
Yes,
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, I highly recommend people watch it. I mean, it's still, if you can get your hands on a Blu-ray, it looks fantastic, and just the sets are amazing. Like the houses, they look so exaggerated. The angles at which everything is, the sets are, it's just totally fantastical world, which has a huge influence on like the films of Tim Burton. If you think about like the way his films incorporate black and white design and just strange angles to buildings and stuff like that. So but yeah, check out German Expressionism. It's really truly like the birth of cinema.
Yeah, I like it. And for sure, whenever you were giving your description of it, when I watched this trailer, silent films, first off, creepy, so creepy, but like the fact of how they use the lenses, the different zooms, the different angles, and like you said, the use of the shadows. It's like, wow. I was impressed for these shots from over 100 years ago that they were doing this. And it like really, it took me in. But I have to wonder, and you did mention it, it was done during the Weimar Republic, post World War I. And the German Expressionism really is the 1920s to the 1930s. Would you say, and if you don't know, I mean, I don't know either, but I'm just asking, would you say that in the 1930s, like the increased depression, economic depression, and the rise of fascism and Nazism Is that why this movement ends in the 1930s?
It absolutely is. Yeah. Goebbels, I don't know exactly when, but he nationalized the film industry, and that's what really killed this whole movement and really killed the momentum of all of these filmmakers' careers and a lot of the actors. Some people stayed and some people joined the Nazi Party, but a lot of these people left and they came to America or went to England and stuff. But yeah, that's where it really ends. And if you want a really great example of a film that sort of like shows this is all coming to an end, I would watch M um, by Fritz Lang. It does have sounds in the early 30s, but it definitely shows the economic hardships going on, and it's definitely starting to show mob rule and all these things starting to crop up in Germany.
Oh, that's really interesting. And it kind of makes me wonder, and that definitely goes into number five, how long
Mhm.
does it take for German cinema to come back and what is the next movement? And like I said, that
Mhm.
goes right into number five. What's your number five for us?
Yeah, number five is the new German cinema, which is really from the late 60s to the early 80s. But predominantly, it's the 70s that the new German cinema really um, took off. And what defines a new German cinema is much like the Taiwanese New Wave, which I talked about, is a bunch of artists looking for a German identity in cinema. From a country that has really been branded evil and sort of pushed aside, um, decimated by America, and of all these imports of American cinema and British cinema, and they don't really have an identity. And this whole time period is these filmmakers trying to find what that identity is on screen. And famous names like Rainer Werner Fassbinder, Werner Herzog, Wim Wenders, um, Marguerite von Trotta. These filmmakers were looking for what makes German people Germans. And the film I want to talk about, that's I think the best or one of the best of them all, but it really captures this theme of identity, is called Kings of the Road from 1976. This film perfectly ties into the end of the Expressionism movement. It's about a traveling projector maintenance worker. He goes from town to town and he fixes movie theaters projectors for them. And he is going to these theaters, and you see the kind of films they're playing. They're either playing like adult movies or they're playing like these comedies about goofy German stereotypes of lederhosen and just plump guys with cartoonish features and stuff. And this guy is traveling around and he doesn't have an identity. He's like looking at all these things, and it's such a perfect way to show that this film is talking about identity by talking about how their own films have no German identity. And it's a road movie, so he's traveling all over Germany, which is this great country full of landscapes, and he's just marveling at all of these beautiful countryside views before he's getting to the next town. And it's really like seeing leftovers from the war, and like just he really has no identity, and he kind of confronts the idea of Wim Wenders, the director, is confronting the idea that these guys are completely lost. They have no idea who they're supposed to be, or what does it mean to be German during this time. So this is also a rather long film, but it's beautifully photographed. And if you want to watch a film that really, even though it's 30 years after the war ended, you can still see even that time period. There's still a lot unresolved.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about and comment on that you just said, but the fact that there's a film like this, Kings of Rhodes, in 1976, and even in 76, German cinema is trying to identify what it is, after Expressionism died, after World War II ended. And even after Germany really started to recover economically, Germany was still split into two separate countries, West Germany and East Germany. And in the early 1950s, going to the 60s, to go into the 70s, you have the rise of the European Coal and Steel Company, which is the beginning of the European Union. So, like right after World War II, Germany is merged into what will become the European Union to make sure World War III doesn't happen again. So, this integration in Europe starts taking off. And then by the 1970s, the UK is in it and a lot of other countries in it. And so, European evolution of individuals not necessarily thinking about themselves just as a German, but also thinking of themselves as Europeans as wholes, is evolving German identity. And then going into 1976, when this film came out, we're just almost 10 years, actually 13 years from the Berlin Wall coming down and a reunification of Germany taking place and the birth of the EU officially coming out in the early 1990s. Like German and what a German is in cinema has evolved so quickly over this time period. I would be really interested to see how this film depicts all of that for sure. All right, now let's go ahead and move into number 4. Where are we going to this time?
Yeah, number 4, a movie that I absolutely love, the Iranian New Wave of the late '80s, and it's still kind of going on now. Just like new voices cropping up all the time, but predominantly the '90s is when the Iranian New Wave really hit international acclaim. And this is a movement of filmmakers that took sort of the realism from other countries' films and wanted to blend it into their own sensibility, which is they made films, these sort of metatextual films about real life events, but they're not documentaries. There's fake documentaries about real things that happened. And this is led by 2 filmmakers, Mohsen Makhmalbaf and Abbas Kiarostami. But other filmmakers like Jafar Panahi and Asghar Farhadi, I'm sorry, I've probably mangled all those names, made just exquisite films. And it's sort of hard to really put into words unless you're watching them what it means by like these metatextual things. So the film I do want to talk about that perfectly captures this whole movement is called Close Up from 1990 by Kiarostami, which is based on a real life event of a man who is so lonely and can only really communicate to the world through watching movies, poses as Mohsen Makhmalbaf, this famous filmmaker, and goes to this family's house and tells them who he is, and this family takes him in because they think he's this famous individual. Only that they find out he's a con man and he gets arrested. And Abbas Kiarostami, who is a friend of Makhmalbaf in real life, reads about this and decides he wants to make a film about it. So he makes this fake documentary about the trial of this man and how this man's loneliness caused him to do this, and he can only relate to the world through cinema. And so the movie is really about how we relate to the world through cinema, but it's also about how these people have to make films under specific rules under the government, and so it doesn't really talk about those things. It's kind of exploring the identity of these people under this rule without, it sort of brushes up against the censorship and the things that they have to get, have to work around to get to these things. It's a really touching movie because it's really about this guy and these filmmakers and how they're affected by him and how their pictures have affected this man. And it's such a new kind of movie. I haven't seen anything quite like it, but many Iranian films are very similar to this, where they're recreating moments in time and how cinema really affects them.
See, this is just so fourth wall breaking to me. It's like the film is talking about life, but it's talking about life directly to the audience, and in such a real way. And like you said, against the censorship of the regime, because in 1980s, it was just 1979 that the Iranian Revolution took place. So the idea that you have an Iranian New Wave in cinema take place in the 80s and 90s completely makes sense to me, because whatever they were doing in film pre-1979, I'm sure it changed drastically after 1979.
Oh yeah.
But to see a film like this, and just even in the trailers and the way it was shot and the topics, I was like, wow. I was like, this is really, really fourth wall breaking. And I, like, once again, I couldn't believe how much it sucked me in and real it seemed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these films are really, and they're really funny too, because they're like joke funny, but they just have these great humanistic moments where people are fumbling for things, and it just captures this realism in life to where not everything is always so serious. Specifically in Close Up, there's a guy, he's going door to door trying to find a tape recorder so he can get this interview, but it's sort of, it's almost like Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin-esque sort of gag where he keeps going door to door and keeps getting rejected over and over and over again. It sort of leads you into this story. Yeah. These are great films, man. I wish they were. Close Up is relatively available here in the States, but there's so many other ones from this time period that I wish were available to American audiences.
This is great. Like I said, I'd be very interested for future conversation to talk about cinema pre-New Wave and New Wave.
Yeah.
But for another time. All right, coming in at number 3, where are we going?
Yeah, number 3, we're coming here stateside. We're talking about the New Hollywood movement. This is the late 60s up until the early 80s here in America. This is when the studio system collapsed in America, and the money people, the producers, relied on the new voices here in America. So we're talking about films like Easy Rider and Taxi Driver and The Godfather and Wanda and Mikey and Nikki and Bonnie and Clyde. There's so many films from this era. I could go on for like another hour just naming the films, like Scorsese and Coppola and Spielberg and Bogdanovich, and just this huge boom of American art house cinema.
And Star Wars.
And Star Wars. Gonna go Star Wars. This whole movement is like, it's arguably the greatest moment in American history. And it's American filmmakers taking influence from the old studio films that they loved, but also all of the things happening in Europe and Japan. These moments of realism in cinema, going to bring into America to explore economic hardships and American character in film and the Vietnam War. And then obviously you mentioned Star Wars. We get to Jaws and Star Wars, where we start to create the blockbuster cinema. But the film I want to talk about here, I think is the greatest filmmaker of this time period, is Robert Altman. And the film that I love the most, and I think it encapsulates this whole movement the best, is his film Nashville from 1975, which just has a huge cast of characters. It's like another 3-hour epic about one weekend in Nashville. It's a country music get together where there's just all these people kind of intertwining, and you see all the stuff happening of this decade. There's political election going on that you see in the background. You see the effects of the Vietnam War and Watergate, and you see all the different clashes of race and culture and class and all these things happening. This one weekend, as all these characters kind of come in and out of the picture here, all culminating in a beautiful musical performance. Where there's several performances about the film, but the ending is really great. And so, yeah, I would think if you're really looking for a film that really shows all of the mechanics of the new Hollywood system, I would say check out Nashville.
Right. All that being said, and I think you're right about the new Hollywood movement. I agree with you completely. Okay. I think the 1960s and 1980s completely rewrote how cinema was done in the US, and most certainly still has affected things today, without a doubt. However, Nashville, country music, this trailer, you got to sell me a little bit more, buddy. I'm not the biggest country music Nashville fan. So if you get one sentence to sell me on why I should watch this movie about Nashville and country music, what would that one sentence be?
I would say, don't worry about the music. I would say focus on the characters. It's got so much to say about the characters in that film.
All right, that's 3 sentences, but your first one, I'll take. Your first one was good. Don't worry about the music. I can dig that. Because, like musica, whether it's soundtracks or an orchestra scoring the film, music has a profound effect on how we feel about a movie. So if I can be told by you, don't worry about the music, still love it, I can dig it.
I'm in the same boat with you. I do like country music, but I don't particularly love it. And don't worry about the music.
All right, excellent. Let's keep going before our country music fans turn off the podcast. Now, getting to our number 2, where are we going?
Yeah, so these last 2 are really the most important movements probably in all of cinema. So number 2 is the Italian neorealism movement of the 1940s and the early 1950s. This is post-war cinema. This is mixing documentary with drama, with narrative filmmaking. This is a movement of a handful of filmmakers that wanted to show the living conditions and after the fall of Mussolini, the economic hardships of the country. And we're talking about Roberto Rossellini, Vittorio De Sica, Federico Fellini was a small player in this at this time. They made films that showed not only how the war or how the war affected them, but the post-war, like these people were just so poor and really were scraping to get by. And the film that to me encapsulates that the best is a film called Bicycle Thieves from 1948, directed by Vittorio De Sica. which is about a man who's a poster hanger, and he and his son have to go out and they have to ride a bicycle to get around and hang his posters. And then one day his bicycle gets stolen, and it's his single it's like the single most important thing in his life, because he can't earn a living if he doesn't have his bicycle to get around. So it's him and his son going around the city looking for his bike, trying to get it back, which then creates a situation for him. Is he desperate enough to steal someone else's bicycle to earn a living? So these are films that are really changed the world, because they started to focus on poor people, and they started to focus on real situations for people. And this is something that really wasn't in cinema before. So and also showing how the Italians did it. So it also another identity avenue showing or being shown in these films. So it's not a good time, but Bicycle Thieves is one of the most important films ever made.
I like this for a lot of different reasons. And one, to help contextualize, the idea of bicycle thieves for our listeners out there. So the idea that the individual uses a bicycle to get around and the bicycle is stolen, that in and of itself seems like a big deal. However, it's more of a big deal than just that. Like, what people need to realize is this is in the middle of a Great Depression in Italy, economically speaking, and right after World War II. There's a whole lot of insecurity about what's really going on, who's really in control. And a bicycle at that point in time would have been valued even above what people think of what a car is worth today, because we're in the middle of an economic recession. So like, the fact that this individual is really contemplating the idea of stealing something of that much worth, because it was stolen from them, and then intermixing it with the war had just ended. Will anyone really come to arrest me if this takes place? Like, who's in control of the country? It's,
Mm-hmm.
I think, extremely grappling with socioeconomic issues in Italy at the time. And like I said, people, when you think of bicycle thief, think of something much bigger. Think of like a really luxurious car, like $100,000 car today, having that stolen from you, because that's the value of a bicycle back then, especially at this very important time in Italian history.
Oh
But I
yeah,
also
yeah.
wanted to ask you, so I remember in a previous conversation we talked about Italian cinema. You said they were churning out Italian movies pretty quickly. Do you have any like idea, like, so this film post World War II, about how long do you think it would have taken to actually film and churn this film out? Because today what it takes, like a year, sometimes 2 or more years in order to make
Mm-hmm.
a film. What would we be talking about here?
I don't really know, but I imagine it didn't take them more than a couple months to film some of these films, because I know they were there was a mix of documentary footage as well as stage stuff. So a lot of these things were shot in the streets with handheld cameras. So they would go out and shoot with people with no license or anything. They're just kind of making these rules up as they were going out there shooting these films. So I imagine there's only maybe a quarter of the time it takes to make a movie today.
Interesting, interesting. And as far as editing back in those days, because they're shooting on real film, like their version of editing would just be cutting and splicing film together, right? It's not really like musical editing or soundtrack editing or anything like that. Like, post-production would have been pretty quick in this time period, yes?
Well, yes and no. Yes, they are cutting film to film, but they're also cutting strips of the sound together. And there is sound design, but it's much more complicated than we think about today. And I'm not really that versed in how sound design was done back then, but yeah, they still did do sound design. Italian film specifically has a long history of not recording live sound. So they would dub everything, include
Really?
all the actors, all of the sounds. So I think post production actually takes longer for Italian films than other countries' productions, whereas maybe their shoot times or less, because they're not really worried about capturing the sound on or live sound. But yeah, even but that's also part of later on, and not to get too far into it, but where Italians exported so much of their cinema, because they didn't have to worry about the sound. They could just send it to another country, and then they could just get completely re-recorded in another language.
That's interesting. That's awesome. I would have never thought about that, Armand. I like to get into the movie making process of stuff as well.
Yeah.
All right, now let's go ahead and head to our number one. Where are we
Yeah.
going?
Oh yeah. So speaking about the movie making process, arguably the 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 movement that had the most effect on the history of cinema is the French New Wave. I can't get around it. You got to talk about it because it is, as far as movie language goes and cinematic grammar, the French New Wave changed all the rules for everything. And we're talking about, this is predominantly in the 60s. Some of the films came out in the late 50s that sort of began to change. But the 60s is really where things take off. And to me, it's like, if you're looking for films that really explore that decade, it's the French that did it the best. We're talking about breaking all the rules. Like there's a handful of filmmakers most of them were critics in the 50s, and they were like just really deep into cinema and decided all these old ways, they got to go. So they start making films that are out, taking place out of order. They invented the jump cut, which is not really worrying about a smooth transition to explain to the audience where we get from A to B. It's just like, we're here, we have a thought, and bam, we're in the next thing. And just camera angles and trying to figure out different ways of shooting stuff, shooting the backs of people's heads while they're talking, just really shaking up all the old rules of cinema and coming up with new and exciting ways to do that. And we're talking about filmmakers like Francois Truffaut and Eric Romer and Agnes Varda, Alain Resnais, if you want to get into the weirder aspects of this movement. But the real rock star of this whole movement was Jean-Luc Godard. He's the one who broke the most rules and really took cinema into some very strange places as the decade went on. But the film I want to talk about that is sort of encapsulates all of this from him is a film called Pierrot le Fou from 1965. It is two-pronged. It's all of the things you would think about from the New Wave, all of the breaking all the rules, the edits, playing scenes twice, just jump cuts, and the playfulness, the references to other movies from the 50s, and pop art aesthetic that's really colorful. But also it's talking about politics. It's talking about male and female relationships. It's criticizing the French occupation of Algiers. And so the French New Wave definitely gets political in the late 60s, but Pierrot le Fou sits right in the middle where it's still exploring all of the fun aspects of things that this movement is doing, but it also is starting to get deep politically. It stars Jean-Paul Belmondo, who just passed away this year. He was a fantastic actor, and he was one of the biggest stars of this time period. And so if you want to see something that's just outright fun and got a little edge to it, you got to see Pierrot le Fou.
Yeah, this is the one film on the list that I have seen. And it was, in fact, in my French cinema class during undergraduate time. And in fact, it was shown in representation of the French New Wave, the Nouvelle Vague. Mm-hmm. And so, like, when I started watching this trailer, I was like, wait a second. I was like, Pierre le Fou. I was like, I've seen this old crazy Pierre. Yes, I know you. And like you said, it deals with a very, very sensitive time in French history surrounding the French-Algerian War and independence and the decolonization of Africa. And it's not just a French issue, it's European decolonization of Africa. So, I mean, this is a major topic. And then, like you said, even important things, like we take for granted the jump cut, but that had to start somewhere. And, I love a good jump cut in a movie. It's like, don't give me some segue, or I don't always need a montage of music and random events in order to transition me from one thing happening to another. Just sometimes, boom, send me there. And it's the French New Wave, like you said, that really brought us there. And like you said, Agnes Varda, I'm familiar with her and a lot of the other different people. I mean, so much was happening at this time period. I think you're right. This movement definitely revolutionized a lot of cinema around the world, and not just in France.
Oh yeah. I think because of them, we have, like I said, the Hollywood New Wave, and there's just so much that it influenced all the way till now. Like you watch even commercials on television are influenced by the techniques these directors came up with.
Excellent choice. And there you have the list, listeners. But now, as is our custom on any top 10 list, let's dig a little deeper. And Gregory Day, we have to ask, why did you choose this list? I mean, a list called 10 Important Film Movements. That's a pretty big flag to post up, but granted, you say 10 important film movements. You don't say the most important film movements. So I'll give you that. So why this list?
Yeah. So I guess first off, I talked about a few of these things previously, and I just want to make sure that we got the chance to contextualize those things for folks who maybe don't understand what a new wave is, or or what a an art movement is in cinema, because so much of it is commercial. So I want to bring that up, but also it's kind of important, that if you're going to get into cinema, I kind of really want to study and everything to kind of know where these things come from, and the moments in history where things are born from.
Excellent, excellent. Sounds good. But all that being said, my next follow-up question, I like to start asking you now, especially in this list with 10 important film movements, certainly you had to have a couple runners up. Is there any shout outs you want to give?
Yeah. I had to cut a few. So one was the South Korean New Wave from the early 2000s, where we got films like Old Boy and Memories of Murder from. But the one I really had to cut was the Japanese New Wave from the 60s and 70s, which had a break with their formalist cinema, which was, had more on-screen violence and sexuality, and a lot of handheld, just really politically driven stuff as well. So I'll save that for another time. But yeah, check out those two new waves as well.
Excellent, excellent. I know our listeners always love a little extra to go out there on. All right, so my next one though is really quite subjective, and really for me, it's kind of a poli sci thing. We always thinking about the future; it's what we do. But leaning more toward modern cinema. Granted, you did have one film that was 2001, but I mean, it makes sense that all of these movements are in the past because, well, I mean, frankly, you have to have them in the past in order to see that they were, in fact, a movement, that they were significant enough to be called a movement. But if you were going to guess, or if there's something you are already seeing, what do you think is perhaps the next important film movement that's currently going on today?
Yeah, there is something very exciting happening in mainland China. Um, I don't know enough about it to really label it, but there is these generations of filmmakers from mainland China that operate outside of government produced cinema, and they're kind of defined by their generation. So right now we're living in an overlap with the sixth generation and the seventh generation, which is kind of what they're called. But the thing that's happening right now is, and I think we talked about this a little bit previously, is there are some films coming out that are about how capitalism and corporatism and globalization is affecting the average Chinese person, and how overwhelming it is, and how economically desperate some people are. And I think when we look back at this period in 10 to 20 years from now, we're going to see that films from filmmakers like Jai Zhangqi and Bai Gan, who've done these films like Ashes Pierce White, I talked about previously on this show. There's a great film called An Elephant Sitting Still. That's a epic about living in harsh economic conditions in China right now. I think these sorts of films, which are engrossing character studies, but also economically bleak, is going to, it's going to be revealed to be a movement, and probably more. Well, I hope so. I hope that more directors will make films like this, but it's hard to say with what's going on in China. And I'm not educated enough to know the freedoms that independent filmmakers have in China right now. But I think when we look back at it right now, this is going to be what people are talking about.
That's interesting to me. It really is, because I mean, the idea of commenting on the economic progression of the individual Chinese person today in China, it seems like, depending on your interpretation and your film, you might not be able to make that film in
Mhm.
China. So I am very interested to see, what exactly you're talking about, and I'm going to get you to send me some of those movies again, so I can take a look at them and find out a little more personally.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And a final question to you, one we always ask no matter what list. Why is this list important? And I don't mean this in the context of how I previously asked you, but rather, why should anyone care about the film movements of the past when there's so much current movie making going on? Go ahead and tell the good people.
Yeah. I mean, when's the last time you saw a film that really had any innovation or ingenuity to it? There's a lot of good stuff coming out these days, but if you look at modern cinema, so much of it is driven by wanting to maximize box office tickets, and trying to please every person's opinion of it. So a lot of the stuff is not driven by ingenuity or innovation in the cinema, but there are things going on like we talked about in China. But if you go back and look at these movements, You'll be able to see the context of where they were born, why the language changed, and will offer a really satisfying view of cinema, throughout its history.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And really, I think there's a very current example of exactly what you're talking about, how that's out right now to illustrate the point of when was the last time anyone did anything new in cinema? And in particular, I'm talking in the United States for this instance and in Hollywood. You know, just a few years ago, like really just a few years ago, the Resident Evil franchise ended. This was a franchise based on a video game that produced like 7 movies, okay?
Hmm.
The last one just finished a couple years ago and out right now is a new remake starting a brand new franchise of the exact same video game basis. It's like, wow. I was like,
Hmm.
not even going to give a little more time for it to breathe, just going to
Hmm.
rehash it right away. And box office numbers are most certainly climbing back up. I mean, there's a lot of movies like Venom, for instance, to go on the comic book wave that's happening right now, if you want to call it that. But Venom has made over $400 million. So it seems like comic book movies are going to keep going on and on and on and on, even though now we're starting to get a lot of repetitiveness in those storylines. In, for instance, like the Marvel Disney cookie cutter system for what a comic book movie looks like, the tropes that they use, the one-liners, the zingers.
Hmm.
It seems like originality has kind of left the room.
Yeah. I mean, independent cinema around the world is still thriving, although not as much as it has in the past. But there's still great things out there, so I don't want to discourage anyone from seeking those films out. But yes, you are right on the money. Studio productions are about as bad and bland as they could possibly get these days.
Right. And perhaps we're gonna have to do a list one day of like the newest, edgiest kind of independent cinema films that you see going on out
Oh yeah.
there one day. Yeah. Well, let me say thank you so much for coming on today. But before you go, I want to ask you, what's the latest thing you've been working on for the people to go check out with Hipsville AD?
Yeah. The last thing I did was that it was from our Halloween episode. I'm taking a little break from writing, gearing up for the new year. But go check that out. You don't have to necessarily be in the Halloween mood to go check out my last piece on George Romero and his zombie films, which were very unique and brought a lot of ingenuity to cinema through his zombie films. And yeah, that's where I'll leave it for now.
Excellent. And go ahead and tell our Lofi listeners out there where they can find you.
Yeah, you can find me at Bad Day at on Substack. It's where I write everything, and you can also find me on Instagram under Hipsville AD.
Thank you so much again, Gregory Day, for coming on. We always look forward to having you talk
Yeah,
with us.
thanks for having me, man.
And that's this Tuesday's Top 10 list. And do you have your own Top 10 list ideas? Send them on in. Do you have questions for our friend Gregory Day over at Hipsville AD? Connect with him. Always remember that Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we be. Peace and well-being to all my human beings out there. Much love and always the best. Pickering Day, signing off.